What happens when a nation goes to war with itself? When brothers point rifles at each other and ideals become more dangerous than bullets? This is the untold story of the American Civil War. Not just a conflict between North and South, but a war for the very soul of the United States. A war that redefined freedom, shattered millions of lives, and left scars that still bleed today. If you're into stories that history books often rush through, this one you won't want to miss. So today, we're diving into the war that nearly destroyed the United States from within. But before we get started, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what other hidden chapters of history you'd like to see next. All right, let's march into the fire. Imagine a young nation, freshly emerged from its independence, fueled by the promise of freedom and prosperity. The United States of America was growing, but not in harmony. It was like a house built on cracked soil, solid on the outside, but on the verge of collapsing from within. In the north, factories roared with the advance of the Industrial Revolution. Cities grew, trains cut across the land, and the idea of progress was measured by the sweat of machines, not the pain of whips. There, many believed that slavery was a moral burden and an obstacle to modernization. In the South, however, cotton reigned supreme. Vast plantations sustained an entire economy, but that wealth came at a price. Millions of black lives enslaved. For Southern landowners, the slave system wasn't just an economic model, it was the backbone of their way of life. And any threat to it was seen as an existential affront. For decades, the political balance between slave states and free states was maintained by a thread, through fragile agreements like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. But that thread was fraying. Tension grew in Washington. Fiery speeches echoed in Congress. The press inflamed the masses with headlines about runaway slaves, rebellions, and armed confrontations in disputed territories like Kansas. And then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois with sharp words and a firm stance against the expansion of slavery, was elected president. For the North, he was hope. For the South, a sentence. The Southern states saw Lincoln's victory as the confirmation of their worst fears, that slavery's days were numbered. The idea of remaining in the Union under this new government became unbearable. In less than 2 months, South Carolina declared its secession from the United States. Other states soon followed. The country, once divided by ideologies, was now split into territories. The march toward war was no longer a hypothesis, it was a countdown. And as the nation plunged into that abyss, one question hung in the air. Could the young republic survive its first great trial? Against itself. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, the still dark sky over South Carolina was torn apart by explosions. Cannons fired upon Fort Sumter, a Union garrison isolated in Charleston Harbor. That blast was not just the sound of a military attack, it was the sound of a nation breaking in two. President Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated, had made it clear that he would maintain control over federal forts, even in territories that now claimed independence. To the Confederates, this was provocation. To Lincoln, it was a matter of national authority. The Confederacy, formed by 7 states that had declared their secession, now acted as a new nation. They had a flag, a president, Jefferson Davis, and an army that was beginning to take shape, but something was still missing, an act that would mark the point of no return. And it came that dawn. After 34 hours of bombardment, with no means to resist, the commander of the garrison, Major Robert Anderson, surrendered. Not a single soldier died in the exchange of fire, but the symbolism of Fort Sumter's fall was devastating. Lincoln's response was immediate. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. It was an attempt to reaffirm the authority of the Union, but it had an unexpected and explosive effect. 4 more southern states, wavering between loyalty and rupture, recoiled at the idea of sending troops to attack their brothers. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy. Now, it was 11 states against the Union, and the war, once feared, was now a grim reality. The lines were drawn. On one side, the United States of America, led by Lincoln, claiming to fight for the preservation of the Union. On the other, the Confederate States, asserting they were fighting for their freedom and way of life. But the words used concealed uncomfortable truths. Union and freedom did not mean the same thing to everyone, and each side was about to discover that the war ahead would be neither brief nor glorious, nor simple. As young men left their homes with flags in their hands and faith in their hearts, they had no idea they were marching into the bloodiest war in American history. And deep down, no one knew where courage ended and tragedy began. The Civil War was not only fought on open fields between uniformed armies and flags waving in the wind. It invaded dining rooms, split homes, and tore families apart. For the first time, the United States witnessed the terror of a war where the enemy could have your same last name, and sometimes the same blood. John Crittenden, a senator from Kentucky, saw his 2 sons take opposite paths. One became a Union general, the other a Confederate general. It was the portrait of a nation fractured not only by politics, but by love, honor, and fate. In many cities of border states like Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, it was common for neighbors to face each other in battle. Childhood friends now pointed muskets at one another. Churches split. Letters exchanged between brothers alternated between pleas for peace and declarations that, if necessary, they would kill each other for their convictions. On the battlefields, this division took on even more tragic contours. The first major military campaigns, like Bull Run and Shiloh, revealed the brutality of modern warfare. Lines of soldiers marched in open fields, only to be swept away by bullets and shrapnel. There was no honor in the blood-soaked trenches. There was fear, mud, and the relentless sound of death. But what shocked the most was the youth of the dead. Boys of 15, 16 years old, driven by dreams of glory, died by the thousands. It was as if America was sacrificing an entire generation in the name of a future that no one could clearly envision anymore. Meanwhile, in the homes left behind, women took on roles that had previously been denied to them. They became heads of households, nurses, factory workers, even spies. It was a war that transformed not only the political landscape, but the entire social structure of the country. Amidst this chaos, a terrifying question emerged. What happens when the war ends, but the hatred remains? How do you reunite a country that had grown accustomed to seeing itself as the enemy? Because if there is something harder than winning a war, it's rebuilding a home where brothers began to see each other as strangers. It was July of 1863. The summer scorched the hills of Pennsylvania when 2 colossal armies met around a small, previously insignificant town, Gettysburg. No one there imagined that in 3 days, that ground would be soaked with more blood than any other in the entire history of the United States. Confederate General Robert E. Lee was confident. After a series of victories in the South, he marched north, hoping to break the Union's morale and perhaps force a peace agreement. But what he found in Gettysburg was fierce resistance and destiny in its cruelest form. For 3 days, from July 1st to 3rd, the earth shook with the sound of artillery, the cries of the wounded, and the desperate screams of those who knew they would not leave that place alive. Cemetery Hill, Little Round Top, the tragic open field of Pickett's charge. Each name would become synonymous with sacrifice and suffering. Pickett's charge, on the 3rd day, was a fatal mistake. Lee ordered thousands of soldiers to march in open fields against the center of the Union line. They advanced under heavy fire, as if marching to the slaughterhouse. In less than an hour, more than half of them fell. and with them fell the South's dream of bringing the war to the heart of the North. Gettysburg was not just a military victory for the Union, it was the moment when the tide of the war began to turn. The Confederate advance had been stopped, and the nation, still divided, saw a glimmer of hope. But the true power of Gettysburg would come weeks later, when Abraham Lincoln, standing among freshly dug graves, climbed onto a small platform and delivered one of the most powerful speeches in history, the Gettysburg Address. Short, direct, but immortal. There, he redefined the purpose of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Gettysburg was an open wound, but also a promise that the pain would not be in vain. But the war was far from over. Until then, Abraham Lincoln had fought to preserve the Union. But as the bodies piled up and the cries from the battlefield echoed all the way to the doors of the White House, he realized something. Winning the war militarily would not be enough. It had to be won morally. And so, on January 1st, 1863, the president signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With that gesture, Lincoln gave the war a new meaning. Now it was not just a fight to preserve the nation. It was a battle to redefine it. Slavery, which had been a political ghost hovering over debates, now became the heart of the conflict. For the Southern states, the proclamation was seen as a direct attack on their very existence. For the abolitionists in the North, it was a moral triumph. And for the millions enslaved in the South, it was a spark of hope, even though real freedom was still far off. Black men began to enlist in the Union Army. Regiments like the 54th Massachusetts proved, with blood and courage, that they were willing to fight and die for a country that had denied them citizenship for centuries. But Lincoln was not seen as a hero by everyone. His opponents in the North accused him of being radical, of overstepping his constitutional powers. The Confederates saw him as a tyrant. Even so, he pressed on, because Lincoln knew you cannot heal a nation by keeping its wounds hidden. The Emancipation Proclamation also had an international impact. European countries like England and France, which had flirted with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy, pulled back. Supporting a government that openly defended slavery became indefensible in the face of the Union's new moral rhetoric. But this new purpose did not make the war any easier. On the contrary, it intensified hatred, hardened the battles, and made reconciliation even more unlikely. Lincoln had redefined the war, and with it, rewritten the destiny of the United States. But by taking this step, he also placed himself in the center of a political and personal crossfire that would still bring devastating consequences. The war was now about freedom. But freedom, as they would soon discover, came with a very high price. As the years passed, the war ceased to be merely a confrontation between armies. It became a silent siege upon the soul of a nation. The enemy was no longer just the soldier on the other side of the trench. It was time. It was hunger. It was the psychological strain of a country that bled day after day. In the cities of the North, the initial enthusiasm gave way to mourning. Lines formed outside mourning houses. Industries produced weapons non-stop, but they also generated a fatigue that corroded the working class. Strikes, protests, and resistance to military drafts began to emerge, even in states loyal to the Union. In the South, the situation was even more desperate. With the naval blockade imposed by the Union, food and supplies became scarce. Women looted markets in cities like Richmond, begging or demanding for bread. Confederate money depreciated day by day, and the fields, once fertile, were left abandoned or destroyed. Entire families lived off the little they could grow, while the war took their sons, husbands, and hope. Suffering made no distinction between soldiers and civilians. On both sides, the pain was universal. And while generals plotted plans on maps, the real battlefield spread across makeshift hospitals, ruined streets, and shattered homes. The wounded returned home without legs, arms, or eyes, and with traumas that had no name but would haunt them for the rest of their lives. On the battlefields, deserters multiplied. Some could no longer bear to kill, others simply could no longer bear to watch. There were those who preferred prison over continuing to fight. And yet, the leaders insisted it was necessary to continue, because retreat would be in vain, because stopping in the middle of the crossing would be to admit that all that death had been for nothing. At that point, the war was no longer a conflict of ideologies. It had become a machine for grinding human flesh. And as the gears kept turning, only one question remained. How long can a country endure its own destruction before collapsing from within? April 1865. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, but the end was near. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, the symbol of the South's resistance, saw his army encircled, starving, and exhausted. And in a modest house in Appomattox Courthouse, before General Ulysses S. Grant, he did the unthinkable. He surrendered his sword. The surrender did not come with loud celebrations. It came with silence, a heavy silence laden with the echo of hundreds of thousands of dead. The war had finally come to an end, but peace, that still seemed far away. The country was in ruins. Entire cities had been burned to the ground. Plantations turned into barren fields. Wounds left open on the body and soul of a nation that barely recognized its own reflection. And then, 5 days after the surrender, as the country breathed its first sigh of relief, the shot came. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had led the United States through its darkest period, was assassinated at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, believed he was liberating the South. Instead, he plunged the nation into new mourning and turned Lincoln into a martyr. The president died without seeing his dream fulfilled, without witnessing the true reunification of the country. His successor, Andrew Johnson, would face an almost impossible task, rebuilding not only cities and states, but shattered hearts and deep-seated hatred. The Union's victory did not erase the pain of the war. It merely began a new conflict, how to live in peace with those who just days before were considered traitors or enemies. The South was on its knees, but humiliation would not generate repentance, it would generate resentment. More than 600,000 dead, millions wounded, an entire generation devastated, and all of this in the name of uniting a country that now needed more than ever to understand what it truly meant to be one people. Because the war was over, but the price of victory, that would still be paid for decades to come. The war had ended. Slavery was abolished, the Union was restored, but the wounds left open did not heal with decrees. What followed was a turbulent, complex period, and for many, just as traumatic as the conflict itself, Reconstruction. The South was devastated, economically, physically, and morally. But it was not defeated in spirit. Many former Confederates still saw the United States as an enemy government, and the newly gained freedom of the formerly enslaved was, in their eyes, an unbearable affront. The federal government, attempting to stitch the nation back together, sent troops to enforce the new laws. Plantations were divided. Black men were guaranteed the right to vote, at least on paper. Schools for the formerly enslaved were opened. Black men entered Congress. For the first time in American history, democracy seemed within reach for all. But that new promise of freedom did not last long. Extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, spreading terror throughout the South's nights. Lynchings, threats, arson, and massacres became weapons to maintain the old status quo. Skin color once again defined who was a citizen and who was a target. Meanwhile, the North began to lose interest. Reconstruction was expensive, politically exhausting, and many simply wanted to move on. Gradually, federal troops were withdrawn, and with them, the guarantees of freedom. What followed was a century of segregationist laws, institutionalized racism, and historical silence. The South may have lost the war, but in many ways, it won the peace. Even so, not everything was lost. The seeds of freedom had been planted. The memory of those who fought, black and white, kept the flame of justice alive. Decades later, the civil rights movement would reignite that struggle. But it all began there, with the courage to reimagine a country where everyone could truly be free. The Civil War was not just an armed conflict. It was the moment when the United States looked at itself and decided what kind of nation it wanted to be. And although the answer is still being written today, one thing is certain: the blood shed between brothers can never be ignored, because sometimes, to be reborn, one must first be shattered. The Civil War was more than bullets, battles, and banners. It was a brutal clash between what the United States had been, what it thought it was, and what it wanted to become. It was the war that defined the contours of American freedom, that exposed the wounds of slavery, that showed that the unity of a people is not built solely with treaties, but with sacrifice, truth, and above all, memory. Today, more than 150 years later, the echoes of that conflict still resonate. In the streets where statues are torn down, in schools where debates about race reignite old dilemmas, in the voices that demand justice, equity, and recognition. The story of the American Civil War is not just American, it is universal. It is the story of every people that ever had to rebuild after self-destruction, of every nation that ever had to look in the mirror and face its own ghosts. Because in the end, the real war was never just for territory. It was, and still is, for the soul of America. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video and you're passionate about this kind of content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos and discover more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.